Good afternoon. I'm Judith Nadler, University Librarian and Director of Libraries at the University of Chicago. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the dedication of the Joe and Rika Mansueto Library. The Mansueto Library is about rich collections and beautiful spaces to use them in. It is about new programs and marvelous architectural design. It is about intense inquiry in serene environments. And it is an expression of our commitment in the importance and continuity of this importance of libraries for research, study, and teaching at this university now and in the future. We celebrate this dedication here in the Grand Hall of the Harper Memorial Library, the Commons as it is now called. It is President William Rainey Harper who established the centrality of the library when he acquired large collections for his then young university before he even had a library to house them in. And so does Mansueto provide space for collections that we already have, that continue to grow, and we don't have a space. Harper's great legacy of importance of collections and libraries to the university has continued over the time. In 1970, Library Director Herman Fassler opened the doors to the Joseph Regenstein Library and brought together collections from across campus. And with this, he established a tightly centralized library system, the best among our peers, and one that is one of the hallmarks of our fame to the present day. In 2002, Library Director Martin Rankel had the foresight and the wisdom to approach the university administration about the collections and their needs of space, and to take the dialogue about space to the university faculty. To make a case for a physical library at the age of the digital promise, to talk about building a library on site when other universities and other libraries worried about library obsolescence, and when our peers took their collections off-site, was not an easy case to make. And we did it the Chicago way. Carefully, thoughtfully, deliberately, backed up by research, and not swayed by the doubts of others, but focusing on what is important for us, on our vision and our mission. And the outcome is a magnificent library at the heart of campus with wonderful programs and dazzling design. I want to thank everyone who was not embracing the doubt of others and took the bold step of making this achievement possible. President Robert ZIMMER, for his belief in the future of the library. The members of the University Board of Trustees for approving the project. Provost Thomas Rosenbaum for making this project his own and ensuring that it succeeds at every step of the process. The University of Chicago faculty who helped us envision the library of the future, the library of the 21st century. Professor Andy Abbott for chairing the task force on the future of the libraries and for instilling in us the belief that the library is an opportunity. The talented library staff who built the programs, and the magnificent architect Helmut Jahn, who envisioned its great and beautiful design. To our colleagues in facilities to make it possible. to Dean Martha Ross, who worked with me early on in making the case for what is now Mansueto. But first and foremost, my deepest thank you and appreciation to Joe and Rika Mansueto, who made all this possible. This is a great day for the university, a great day for the library, a great day for scholars from around the world who will come here, use our collections and our spaces, and applaud us ages to come. Thank you. And now it is my great pleasure to give you President Zimmer.
Well, I'm, of course, very pleased to add my own welcome to that of Judy on this day of historic importance for the University of Chicago, the day of the dedication of the Joe and Rika Mansueto Library. Although we dedicate it today, the building has already been in use for a few months, and during this time has received an enormous amount of attention for its architectural beauty and the originality of its design, for its engineering features, bringing a new level of technological capacity to the modern library, and from universities and other related institutions around the world where it has, quite frankly, created a great sense of envy, even generating a rethinking of their own approach to libraries. This is a remarkable and diverse impact for a single building which has been open for only a few months, and frankly, I only expect this impact to grow over time as more people become familiar with the Mansueto Library and what it means. Although an architectural gem and an engineering marvel, these features also support and reaffirm the underlying meaning of this building. And the Mansueto Library is a building of very important meaning. Some of you in this room attended the groundbreaking of the Mansueto Library not that long ago, and one of the striking things about that event to me, because I do go to a lot of events, but one of the striking things about that event was the palpable emotion that was attached to it and that you felt in the room or the space that day. And the great emotion was due, I believe, to two aspects of the meaning of the Mansueto Library. First, we were stating, as a university, that we were committed to the idea of a library and to its continued evolution in a new and powerful way. We would not, as others are doing, retreat from the idea and actuality of libraries that had played such an important role in the development of knowledge, the stewardship of our collective histories, and the education of generations. Rather, collectively, as a community, the University of Chicago was declaring its belief in libraries and what they meant in the past and what they will continue to mean in the future. Second, so many of us recall our own personal experiences in libraries with great emotion. I'm certainly among this group. I offer my own experience as an example, which I recounted in part on the day of the groundbreaking, but one I am sure reflects, for many of you, similar experiences, at least similar in meaning, if not in detail. So I grew up in New York City, and there was a local branch of the New York Public Library a few blocks from my house, the Jackson Square branch on West 13th Street in Manhattan. I learned to go there when I was very young, since I was lucky to go to a primary school and a public school, I might add, in which the teachers assigned a large number of research projects. And that library on West 13th Street, which today I believe is now a private house, there was a sign which was not original, but which stuck with me for all these years, and which I've always remembered. It said, "This is a library, feel free." Now, the wonder that I felt in those days in that room, in what seemed like a large, but was in fact quite a small library, and what I was free to learn there, and how it could help me understand all the fascinating things there were to understand, has never left me. I still feel it today every time I'm in a library, great or small. The emotion that we all felt the day of the Mansueto groundbreaking, from the connection to a history of libraries spanning millennia, to our own personal experiences, is echoed today as we celebrate the completion of this vision. In our dedication of the Mansueto Library, we are also rededicating ourselves to the very idea and meaning of libraries. Building the Mansueto Library was a large and complicated project, and there are 5 individuals that I want to specifically acknowledge who made this building possible. First, of course, Joe and Rika Mansueto for their extraordinary generosity, vision, and commitment to the future of the University of Chicago. Helmut Jahn for his striking imaginative design and determination to see it realized. Andy Abbott for the powerful articulation by the faculty of the importance of this project, for the work of our faculty and students, and Judith Nadler, who provided the integrative library vision that makes the Mansueto Library such a successful functioning facility. To Joe and Rika, Helmut, Andy, and Judy, thank you from all of us. Now, it's now my great privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, whose work and contributions to knowledge and understanding is a quintessential example of what happens because of libraries. Tony Grafton is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History at Princeton University. I would like to actually say at the University of Chicago, but I have to say Princeton University. He joined the Princeton History Department in 1975, immediately after earning 3 degrees, his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in history from the University of Chicago. Among Professor Grafton's very widespread special interests are the cultural history of Renaissance Europe, the history of books and readers, the history of scholarship and education in the West from antiquity to the 19th century, and the history of science from antiquity to the Renaissance. We're very proud of his achievements as an alumnus, and we are delighted to welcome him back to the University of Chicago on this special day in the history of the university.
President Zimmer, Joe and Rika Mansueto, Madam Librarian, you don't get to say that often, teachers, colleagues, friends, former students, thank you for bringing me back to my beloved alma mater on this happiest of imaginable occasions. I have to admit that my happiness is tempered with a little bit of, shall I say, breath-robbing terror. My beloved teacher, Arnaldo Momidiano, for many years an ornament of this university, used to look around the Harper Auditorium below here and say, of course, everyone here knows far more than I do about the subject I'm about to discuss. And then he would give a glare like that of the legendary basilisk, and you knew that you would turn to stone if you dared to believe him even for an instant. But I can say in total sincerity, everybody here does know much more than I do about the Mansueto Library. I see Andy Abbott and the others who brought it, who conceived it, like Judy Nadler. I see the donors, I see the magnificent architect. So I do feel a little bit like a sincere version of my great teacher, who in that one respect was insincere. And after all, you certainly don't need me to praise the Mansueto Library. It speaks for itself. It has its own Facebook page. It has its own blog. And even if, like me, you live not in this magnificent city, but in the land of the Sopranos, you can find out an enormous amount about the Mansueto Library from the internet. For even when it's silent, the students who inhabit it are speaking for it. They've posted striking photographs, as striking as these, of what it feels and looks like at every hour of the day on Flickr. They've put up wonderful YouTube videos, a particularly magnificent one of the Mansueto at night in the rain, absolutely spectacular. They've even, I regret to say, described the role it's begun to play in undergraduate hijinks. Now, when I was a student in the college at this institution, undergraduate hijinks, in accordance with the teachings of Aristotle and Max Weber, were confined to spelunking in the steam tunnels and climbing downspouts. Now, apparently, the dome of the Mansueto no sooner takes on a beautiful icing of snow in the first day of winter than it is graced with what the student bloggers call, I regret to say, butt tracks. Still, perhaps there's no greater sign of undergraduate enthusiasm for this library than they've already made it into Mount Mansueto and begun to climb its slippery slopes. Surely, nobody needs an outsider, even a loving alumnus, to praise the Leiter University Libraries at Chicago, for there is no set of university libraries that is more dear to the faculty, the students, and the alumni than the Regenstein and the other libraries of this university. They're a world, and students plot their different regions and societies with the attentive eyes of apprentice geographers and anthropologists. In the A-level basement, the maroon warns new first-year students, people studying in groups have a more festive atmosphere. In the B level, on the other hand, silence is revered. Drop a pencil and prepare for dirty looks that will make your ancestors roll in your graves. Even the Regenstein graffiti, as Quinn Dombrowski taught us, have a unique, not just erudite, but argumentative character. Unconcerned, mocking, violent, thus wisdom wants us. She's a woman and always loves only a warrior. Nietzsche, says a wall, immediately to be corrected, misquoted by someone else who doesn't even bother to note the crucial adjective that's been omitted here. Surely there can be no university whose libraries are the focus of so much thought, so much passion, so much investment, so much affection. You see this especially at what are usually the points of contention. Readers become unhappy, as librarians know, when they have to return their books, and sometimes strenuous means are needed to accomplish this. The Vatican Library, which was a lending library for much of its existence, achieved book return by wrapping each book that was lent out in the chain that normally attached it to its table. But even that wasn't sufficient to remind everyone who had books out where they belonged, and occasionally popes were called into play to write recall letters. In Chicago, by contrast, opposition is true friendship. I found on the web a marvelous correspondence between a student and a librarian to whom he had appealed his fines. "Hello," says the librarian, "I have had the opportunity to look over your fine appeals. Let me say that they were articulate and humorous. My problem is that in September you had $72 waived, in January $87, now you want us to waive $102. The purpose of fines is to encourage, if that's the word, people to comply with library regulations. We occasionally waive fines because we believe that the borrower will not get him or herself in a similar situation. In your case, though, it seems that each time you appeal, the amount is larger. So I am not willing to waive your fines." The student gave in with a good grace and admitted that he was happy to pay the money because he believed so strongly in the enterprise. Yet, as I searched my memory, now failing, and my conscience never strong, I did find a couple of ways in which I might be an appropriate person to speak at this occasion. In the first place, I may be the only alumnus still ambulatory who not only remembers but worked extensively, not just in the Regenstein before Mansueto, but in the old libraries before the Regenstein, when the university's books were jammed into stacks in this building so tightly that they dizzied anybody who tried to find a single volume, and spread out more in the departmental libraries, which we grizzled veterans remember with a certain affection. Oh, for the days when the shelves of Swift and classics bent under 16th and 17th century books bound in vellum, which circulated like those Vatican manuscripts. Great playgrounds for book bums like me, never in small quantity in Hyde Park. Yet, even for us who loved the old system and glowed with delight as we carried elephant folios back to our rooms, the Regenstein transformed everything. Working as a scholar, even a student here, in the old Harper and then coming to Regenstein was like watching The Wizard of Oz when it turns into color. It was breathtaking in scale. It showed the quality of the university's holdings and the brilliance of their organization, which one really hadn't been able to see before. Open to the outside world, it transformed study from a grim troglodytic and misanthropic occupation to something that could be carried on in spacious and comfortable conditions and in natural light. Most important of all, those big loft floors with their brightly color-coded carpets, remember the orange carpet, brought sets of disciplines together in challenging and interesting ways. Classics, Eastern and Western on the 5th floor, religion, psychology, and philosophy on 4, history and other humanities on 3, social sciences on 2. It was a time when interdisciplinary scholarship was beginning to be the mode. Foundations were supporting it, scholars were looking for ways of doing it, and of course the University of Chicago had always pioneered. As a humble undergraduate, I and my friends would count the departmental affiliations of our favorite professors. He's got 5, but she's got 6. But all of that, I think, was a little bit in the realm of theory before the Regenstein opened and embodied interdisciplinary exchange. Everyone knows the wonderful dedication of Jamie Redfield's book, Language and Culture, and Iliad, in which he describes the Regenstein as a place that has made what was impossible possible and what used to be difficult easy. I don't think it's always appreciated how precisely that book describes what the Regenstein actually did. Here was an anthropological approach to an ancient Greek classic, the model of a brilliant interdisciplinary work, something that you really couldn't carry out when the anthropology books were jammed into the basement of Harper and the classics books over in classics. It was a profound and lucid description of the change we all lived through. So I can offer that, and I can offer my homage and appreciation to the Mansueto, and I'll say just a little bit more at the end. The second thing I can do as a historian of books and readers is perhaps to offer a little bit of historical context, a few comparisons that will suggest some of the ways in which this university's libraries do hark back, as President Zimmer suggested, to enterprises that have been central to Western culture for thousands of years. We could start with that greatest of Western collections, great collection, even greater mirage in our collective memory, the Library of Alexandria, founded at the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, maintained by the Ptolemies, the heirs of Alexander the Great, Ptolemy I, himself a poet. A library inspired by Aristotle, that great empiricist, to collect books, collect material as the museum collected artifacts and devices of other kinds, perhaps even built to support the group of interdisciplinary scholars at the museum, though we don't really know quite enough about the institution to say that. From the start, the library had an impressive physical presence. Lodged in the temple of the new god Serapis, it formed part of a splendid campus of gardens and buildings. It had bookstacks full of papyrus rolls and colonnades where scholars could walk and talk in the shade. It was splendid. We wish we knew more than that, but we know that it was splendid. Listen to the Greek geographer Strabo describing the Alexandrian Museum as part of a great series of buildings owed to the benefactions of Alexandria's rulers and great men. The city contains most beautiful public precincts and also the royal palaces, which constitute 1/4 or even 1/3 of the whole circuit of the city. For each of the kings, from love of splendor, was wont to add some adornment to the public monuments, so that now, to quote the words of the poet, there is building upon building. In the same way, we now have building upon building here, the Mansueto and the Regenstein both bearing their testimony to the extraordinary record of beneficence that has given Chicago's scholars and students these wonderful machines for thinking, these wonderful spaces for research and reflection. The Alexandrian Library was splendid, but it was more than splendid. It was a buccaneering institution. When the Alexandrians wanted the best possible texts of the three canonical Athenian playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, they borrowed the official texts from Athens, paying a large deposit. They then forfeited the deposit and kept the texts. When ships landed in Alexandria, any scrolls on them were collected and stored, we're told, in heaps in a warehouse until they could be cataloged, and if the texts weren't present in the library, the scrolls were copied. A whole branch of manuscripts of Homer were designated those from the ships. And you'll notice that that's not just a shelf mark, it's a call number. It tells you something about the nature of the texts and gives you a sense of the sophistication of this organization. The library became very big. There are various numbers for the scrolls it contained, none of them very trustworthy. A welter of material, naturally ill-organized. You can stack codexes neatly. You can't stack scrolls neatly. They roll around. A welter of scrolls with little tags on the end. Readers confronted a daunting mass of information. A daunting mass, moreover, that was not just a mine of Greek philosophy and poetry, but a mine with veins of fool's gold. For the library's appetite for texts was so great that enterprising forgers had run up more works by Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and sold them to its agents. In order to deal with this, that poet and scholar Callimachus and others drew up catalogs, Callimachus in the first place, working out rules for discriminating between genuine and spurious works, and wonderfully using the terminology of Greek kinship law. We're often told that no one had an idea of authorship before modern times. Well, Callimachus classified the works he took to be genuine under the word gnesios, which is the same word you'd use for a legitimate child, and the spurious ones he called nothoi, bastards. That seems to indicate a sense of literary scholarship. The actual quality of Alexandrian scholarship was controversial at the time and remains so now. When Timon of Phlius, a funny philosopher, met the poet and scholar Aratus, and Aratus said, "How can I get a good text of Homer?" Timon said, "Well, don't take one that somebody's been correcting," meaning a scholar like Aratus. Get one that somehow has escaped these hairs. Yet, the Alexandrian Library seems to have been the place where the text of Homer was stabilized in a way remarkable for something transmitted in the age of manuscripts, stabilized far more successfully than the printers of England in the late 16th and early 17th century managed to stabilize the text of Shakespeare. Here, too, one thinks of Chicago, that center of library science. I think we'll hear more about this from Andy Abbott tonight. A place where the library has never been a passive receptacle for books, but a place where people have thought hard about classification and use and what a collection needs to have. The Alexandrian Library was destroyed. In fact, it was destroyed over and over again. Caesar destroyed it in 48 BCE. The warring armies of Aurelian and Zenobia destroyed it in the 3rd century. Christian mobs burned it down in the 4th century, and Amr the Conqueror supposedly consigned its books to the flames in 641 on the ground that if they agreed with the Quran, they were superfluous, and if they didn't, they were fraudulent. I don't place much faith in any of these stories. What we do know is that the spells of alternate humidity and drought which would have afflicted books at the Egyptian seashore would have done in those scrolls long before Amr reached Alexandria in 641. But this Alexandrian model has always, I think, inspired makers of great libraries, from the Attalids of Pergamum, the rivals of the Ptolemies of Alexandria, who built their own great library, and when the Ptolemies refused to let them import papyrus, started using carta pergamena, parchment, to make their books on, an innovation that would have a long afterlife. Down to the Renaissance library, Vatican Library, whose third librarian, Giovanni Andrea Bussi, wrote in a copy of Plautus, one of the few notes we have about the Vatican Library, the so-called Scholium Plautinum, indicating what was on his mind. These libraries, I think, have always been conducted in a kind of Alexandrian spirit, and by that I don't refer to the luxury and the seductive, soft, orientalizing visions that the word Alexandria often conveys. I refer to a fearlessness worthy of Alexander the Great. when William Rainey Harper captured the Berlin Bookshop of Calvary, even though he didn't have a building to put it in or money to pay for it, when the administrators of the 60s beleaguered on every side in a city that was very difficult to work in a climate when universities were beginning to attract less and less philanthropic help, went ahead with the building of the Regenstein. And in this last decade, when the extraordinary vision of the faculty, the librarians, the trustees, and the Mansuetos has enabled the University of Chicago once again to show in the most vivid, powerful way that the book and the library are no spent forces in our culture. I see that Alexandrian spirit at work. You know, the cities have a certain amount in common. Waterside cities with great, great boulevards and a great passion for culture on the grand scale. It's a marvelous thing to see these connections still play out. The second great model for Chicago's libraries is, of course, the University Library, and that's an older creation than many of us realize. Universities go back to the European Middle Ages, and so do their libraries, at least to the 12th century at the West, and before that in the Islamic learned academies, which Western libraries imitated. These were not research libraries, but they grew. They became too large for traditional means of cataloging and control. The Sorbonne, for example, which had only 4 books in its first mention early in the 12th century, had 300 by the end and more than 1,000 by 1290. That's a lot of books to control. And the Sorbonne began using the most up-to-date techniques to inventory and store them at a time when the French monarchy still kept its accounts in Roman numerals, which gave rise to thousands of computational errors and still employ French social and political historians. The Sorbonne was already paginating its books and inventorying them in Arabic numerals. Scholastics now remembered for their speculative philosophy. Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon wrote brilliant bibliographical treatises on the legitimacy or spuriousness of alchemical and astrological works from the Arabo-Latin tradition that were ascribed to Aristotle and other Greek authorities. So already in the Middle Ages, one can see a precedent for Chicago, this center of new ways of cataloging and holding a collection together. Nobody treated those poor medieval libraries more haughtily than the people I spend my life with, the Renaissance humanists. All of you knew the wonderful passage in Pantagruel, the second book of Rabelais' great novel, in which Pantagruel visits the library of Saint Victor, a parody of the library of the Sorbonne, and sees treatises on the codpiece of the law, the churning ballock of the valiant, the art of farting honorably in society, and the mustard pot of penance. Yet the Renaissance library simply built on medieval foundations. It was from medieval librarians that they learned how to build desks at windows, how to shelve books in ways that kept them in order. But the Renaissance also added new elements that speak to us as well. It was an age of globalization, an age when the world was opened up by trade and imperial expansion, an age when books in new languages and images of new kinds were flooding back into the West. Go to the Vatican at the end of the 16th century, if you were Michel de Montaigne, and they would show you a book in Chinese on beautiful Chinese paper that they couldn't read but regarded as one of their principal pleasures. Go to the Bodleian Library and you would see a magnificent Aztec codex, once John Selden gave it with the rest of his books. Particularly central to this effort were books in what were then called the Oriental languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and Arabic, which scholars used in order to try to create critical texts and accurate translations of the Bible. Great enterprises that we don't think of as library-based. The King James Bible, for one, actually rested on the new global resources that had been assembled in these libraries. These libraries were also the first that saw themselves as centers for academic work. The Vatican was a wonderful place to browse, as Montaigne found, marvelous books chained to the tables, but if you wanted to work, you took them home with you, as Pico della Mirandola did, at least till he got in trouble with the authorities, and they recalled his reader's card. But at the end of the 16th century, when Thomas Bodley created his new library at Oxford, he made a new rule. All books had to remain on the premises, and many of you will have taken the oath of a Bodleian reader and remember this. When Isaac Casaubon, the greatest Greek scholar of the late Renaissance, came to Oxford in 1613, he was delighted to find that he couldn't take books out, for it meant that every serious scholar in Oxford was in the library 6 or 7 hours a day, and he could discuss and argue with them in a way that he hadn't experienced before. These Renaissance libraries did things that now seem second nature. For example, and that were not second nature to Alexandria or to the Middle Ages. The Alexandrian collection, great though it was oriented, so far as we know, to the past and to the canonical. It was meant to be a complete collection of known literatures and bodies of thought. Renaissance libraries actively collected pamphlets in which the theologians of the day tore and shredded one another, travel literature with its new information about the outer world, histories of the contemporary world. Like Francis Bacon, not normally thought of as a fan of libraries, the librarians of the late 16th and early 17th century saw knowledge and the books that held it in very progressive terms as bodies that were always going to expand and that a library had to hold. This pre-modern library reached its peak in the age of the Enlightenment and the Republic of Letters in that great new university founded at Göttingen in the 1730s, designed to teach the modern sciences as well as the classics, the greatest of German universities. The library had a budget, an innovation. So previously, libraries depended on irregular funds, gifts of funds, but the Göttingen Library had a budget. It also had one of the greatest of librarians, Professor Christian Gottlob Heine, classicist and student of ancient art. Heine personally registered acquisitions. In order to see to it that the important books were made known, he reviewed them himself in the Göttinger Gelehrte Anzeiger, 8,000 of them in his career as librarian. I don't know if Judith Nadler has time to do this as well. I rather suspect not. Like Harold Lloyd or one of the Marx brothers, he ran desperately after the accumulation, doing his hopeless best to keep the books in subject order so that they still reflected the encyclopedia of learning. He didn't achieve that, but he did accomplish something more. In Göttingen, in every field, for the first time, the books outran the scholars and the scientists. The books became a vast ocean that no one had fully explored, but an ocean on which they cast themselves. So you see the Göttingen scholars, long before anthropology was a university subject, reading travel literature and ethnography, and coming to see the Hebrews who wrote the Bible and the Greeks who wrote their epics in new ethnographic terms. A transformation that has its connections to the transformation that Jamie Redfield and other scholars have carried out much more recently. I think that the University of Chicago, with its encyclopedic aspirations, its extraordinary coverage of all regions of the world, of multiple traditions and literatures, is very much in the great tradition of the Enlightenment Library, as it is in its passion for thinking about what a library should be, how books should be organized, how information should be made available. Now, the final library that preceded the Regenstein, the original University of Chicago system as that developed, is a strange and important story in its own right because it too speaks to one aspect of the University of Chicago. We look back at it and we deplore aspects of this old system. The fact that disciplines were separated like Leibnizian monads, that interdisciplinary work was almost physically inconceivable, that book purchases were often duplicated with partial sets in Harper and in the departmental libraries, that books were lost. And here I can confess that when you took books out of the departmental libraries, you knew you'd never have to pay an overdue fine, for it was always a friend with a scholarship job on the desk. Probably not a good thing to confess, but maybe it's late enough to say that. What matters, though, is that this system of libraries represented, as all the others I've mentioned have, a particular vision of knowledge, a deeply specialized vision. a vision in which the great professor was no longer, like Christian Gottlob Heine, someone possessed by the desire and pursuit of the whole, of all of knowledge, but a great specialist, someone who knew one subject, had tunneled into the sources and the literature more deeply than anyone behind him. And seminar libraries were designed to produce more people in this mode, lined with the bibliographies, the introductions to various Wissenschaften, the bound volumes of periodicals that would guide you to become an excellent specialist. It all sounds a little forbidding now, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, this was a path of adventure. This was the path of adventure that took 10,000 Americans to study in German universities in the 19th century, where 5,000 of them took their PhDs. And I think that from that very beginning, alien and forbidding though it now looks, dates one quality of the University of Chicago libraries that never seems to change. You always have bums on pews. The University of Chicago libraries are full of passionate readers, passionate workers, passionate arguers, and that goes back to a time when the subjects they were passionate about looked very, very different from the subject order that we now feel our passion for. Finally, the Mansueto Library. This, as I've already said, represents the most dramatic and marvelous commitment to the library as an institution and to the book as a particular tool of knowledge. It also represents a response, and a tremendously important one, to wider transformations in the order of knowledge and the method of learning. All university libraries have been rethinking their mission since the computer began to transform intellectual work in the 1980s, and then to transform the availability and form of texts in more recent times. Many of them have actually emptied, as scholars find it possible to do at least some of their work with the wealth of material available on the screen of their computer. And many students find it possible to do all their work through materials that we place on e-reserve and through the enormous electronic resources that we make available. Libraries became less pleasant. These great memory theaters that are set up in such an orderly way are battered out of shape inevitably by the thousands of books that enter them every day. So Regenstein lost its wonderful order. And there was a threat that has been realized at great libraries like the Widener, that these magnificent craft will turn into Flying Dutchmen of the mind, sailing along, lights on, no crew at the helm or in the masts. There's been a tendency, in other words, to abandon the library, and a tendency, supported by a rhetoric about dead tree media and similar things, to abandon the book. Pressed for space, uncertain of the importance of books, administrations have emptied parts, or in the case of Minnesota, the whole of great central libraries, turning them into workspaces for students where fast internet and good coffee, well, reasonably good coffee, will at least attract a certain amount of use. Meanwhile, of course, the materials that are available on the web grow staggeringly from day to day. The books in the Google Books project alone are now more in number than the books in the University of Chicago libraries. Google is rapidly moving past Yale and will soon catch up with the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And yet, they're Google Books. Google Books, oddly chosen. If you want to read the first and second part of the first edition of Middlemarch, and the fourth and fifth part of the first edition of Middlemarch, you're welcome to do so on Google Books, but not the third and fourth or the seventh and eighth, which they didn't bother to digitize at the same time. If you want to know about German views of Wissenschaft in the 18th century, you can use Google's information seeking facilities to do that, as long as you type in Wissenschaft rather than Wissenschaft. For Google had problems for a long time with the long S and the F. There are many ways, and that's, not to mention, the many books to which no human being in the world has rights that Google puts up, enabling us to use them, and then takes down again in some sort of eerie game they're playing to see how many scholars will throw their MacBook Pros through the window. There are many ways in which the book remains a better tool than its digital twin. Books have indices that tell you the important things in them instead of search functions that tell you everything. Books can be skimmed much more easily in codex form than in the revived scroll form of the web. There's every reason to think that serious scholars will be using books for the next generation and more. Even scholars who work on subjects where books are printed in the United States and England and exist for the most part in digital as well as analog forms. In a university like this, with its passion for the languages of India and South Asia, with its passion for the Southern Hemisphere, for Latin America and Africa, in those countries, very little is digitized. What's published is still published, and if you're going to access it, you'll access it in codex form. The University of Chicago has committed itself to that, I think, true vision of scholarship as it's going to be for the next generation or two. And the Mansueto Library produces the space for books and the space for reflection for scholars for that time. At least for those of us who are designated, as I found to my fear and trembling that I was in Princeton in the 1970s, heavy users. Back in the 70s, heavy users usually referred to something different. So the Mansueto has done something marvelous. It has provided the kind of space that works as student workspace in the new world, with Helmut Jahn's magnificent elliptical reading room. The thing I wish I could do and won't have time to do in this visit is simply to spend a day there, watch the light change from hour to hour. But it would be even nicer to do it in multiple seasons, as you'll all have the chance to do. An extraordinary space which clearly has already attracted a fanatical crew of devotees. I saw them shrieking with rage as they were ejected this morning at 11 to prepare for today's festivities. And it has produced, in its magnificent caverns measureless to man below the surface of the earth, an extraordinary high-tech way to keep books and make them available in quick time to another generation of scholars for whom they will be essential tools. In that way, the Mansueto is an extraordinary work of practicality to have been brought about by this supposedly impractical university. But the Mansueto also, in a way, presents a challenge and speaks to the situation of learning now in a way no other library I know does. Traditional libraries, from Alexandria to the Regenstein, played two roles. They were please-touch museums for the nerdly that offered vast riches for exploration, and at the same time, they played the police. They protected readers from books that were worthless or spurious or mendacious. The heavy massed volumes of bibliographies and encyclopedias, readers' guides and subject lists, which we learned to use back in the antediluvian 1960s and 1970s, were wonderful mission control for our journeys into the dark space of the library. They showed you where to find things. They told you what you needed and which sort of texts would complement others. There was simply no other way to work. So the library both gave you this magnificent realm to explore and gave you the cartography to explore it in the most effective way. Now, knowledge is no longer confined, even in the magnificent walls of the University of Chicago's libraries. Even heavy users of traditional books, experto crede, usually begin their searches for knowledge not as they know they should, and as I was taught by Hannah Gray, here present, and others, not with a bibliography, but with a bibliography of bibliographies, but with a word or two typed into Google, a lance into the dark. In the old days, we plotted our paths into the stacks of the Regenstein like Arctic explorers, setting up cairns with food and fuel. The stacks were very cold in the original plan for the library. Now we launch ourselves with one tap and hope that Google's algorithms will give us something of what we need. Well, that's the sort of work that's going on in the reading room of the Mansueto, I am quite sure. And in a funny way, that's the sort of library the Mansueto is. It's a library whose contents are classified not by their nature, but by their size. A vast, magnificent, random heap of the treasure and the fool's gold, and who's to tell them apart? A library that embodies the order of knowledge in which we now live, the order of knowledge in which our key to the kingdom is no longer systematic bibliography, but random search. And in that way, I think that the Mansueto poses a challenge, and a challenge particularly to the citizens of this great city of the intellect. After such knowledge, what discrimination? In the presence of such wealth, how to make choices? How will scholars, how above all will students learn to make effective use of this mass of information? What tools will the craftsmen and craftswomen of scholarship in its various forms need to build new artifacts as sound and beautiful as the old artifacts that the scholars of this university have turned out? Scholarship is a craft, and there's no feature of the Mansueto more wonderful than its view of the restoration facilities at the university, where students sitting under that magnificent arc and reading the screens of their laptops see craftspeople working with traditional tools on beautiful books. But how do we make that union take real form? The challenge for this university, the challenge for all universities that support work in the humanities and the social sciences, is now to devise the pedagogy that the Mansueto Library calls for, the pedagogy that offers guidance, as pedagogues always have in the past, to the riches of the web accessible in the reading room and the riches of the tradition of books, almost as easily acceptable in the caverns. It's your duty, colleagues and friends, to enable those who come after us to surf those genuinely endless tidal waves of information as easily and surely as we once walked what seemed the endless stacks of the Regenstein, with a real goal always in mind and led always by a disciplined curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Grafton, for this wonderful, meaningful talk. And yes, you know as much about the Mansueto as many in this room do. You have captured the enthusiasm for building it, you have captured the delight of those who use it, and you have hinted to some of the challenges that will have to be faced in order to make sure that the investment is worthwhile. And yes, we will meet that challenge. The phrase about making the impossible possible and the difficult easy is surely going to also apply to the Mansueto, and will, as you have identified in your challenges, will be even more important to libraries now than they were when the Great Frankenstein was built. And yet, this wonderful achievement would not have been possible if not for the enthusiasm by other alumni like you, who believe in the future of libraries and in the importance of sustaining the role of libraries, would have not come forward to make this great achievement possible. Joe and Rika Mansueto are two proud alumni of the University of Chicago. Joe received his bachelor's from the University of Chicago in '78 and his MBA from the Business School Booth in '80. Rika received her degree in anthropology in 1991. They loved the university, they spent good times at the university, and they have good memories of the library. Joe is chairman and founder of Morningstar, an investment research company which he founded and which has now 2,000 employees around the world. Many of them University of Chicago alums. Rika was an investment advisor in the firm, also an alum of Chicago. I first met the Mansuetos in the magnificent office of architect Helmut Jahn. We had an opportunity to there present our programs, and Helmut presented his architectural design. I was very rewarded by how much Rika and Joe agreed with the programs, loved the combination between tradition, respect for the past, and forward-looking technology, and how engaged they were with actually the architectural design that were pleasing. Working with Joe and Rika in realizing this vision of the Mansueto Library was a delight even greater than the one I felt when I heard that they are willing to step forward and actually support that vision. I thank you very much. And now it is my great pleasure to give the podium to Joe.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Judy, very much for that kind introduction. We've enjoyed working with you, I think as much, even more than you have with us, so it's been a real pleasure. Actually, Morningstar is now up to over 3,000 employees, and an outsized proportion of them are University of Chicago grads. They've made a huge difference to our success, and we love hiring U of C grads. But again, thank you, Judy. Thank you, President Zimmer. Thank you, Tony Grafton, for your insightful talk on the history and meaning of libraries. It was the perfect address, I think, to mark today's occasion. Thank you, Helmut Jahn, for your wonderful design. The library wouldn't be here without you. And thank you to Augusta Read Thomas, who I met this afternoon, for her lovely composition to mark this occasion. That's a real honor to have a composition of that quality, so thank you, Augusta. Rika and I are just so proud and delighted to be associated with the University of Chicago and this spectacular new library that Helmut has designed. Now, our connection to this library goes back probably about 4 years ago when I had lunch with President Zimmer. And I believe Bob was looking for ways to further bind Rika and I to the university, looking for various projects that might resonate with us. And he mentioned that the university was running out of library space to house books, and that the problems that caused for scholars, and that the university might have to go to off-site storage. So I was kind of nodding in agreement. I think I was intrigued at this point. Libraries, I think, like Bob, hold a special meaning to me. And it struck me as a good way in helping to create a new library to help give back to the university. Bob went on, talked about recommitting to the idea of a library, much like he did for us this afternoon, the importance of libraries, the meaning of libraries. My excitement level was rising. And then the clincher for me was when he rolled out the plans by Helmut Jahn. I just immediately, I took him home, showed him to my wife, Rika. I just fell in love with the simplicity, the boldness, and the originality of Helmut's vision. Great design not only solves a problem, but it inspires. And this library design not only solves the book storage problem of the university, but it also does truly inspire. It's stunningly beautiful in its simplicity, with its gorgeous domed reading room at grade level. And I have to think with the abundance of natural light, that those who study there will be inspired to think more creatively and to think more boldly. I also really like what this library says about the university, that this is a place that embraces innovation, challenges conventional wisdom, is willing to take risks, and values great design. Now, Rika and I take an enormous amount of pleasure in seeing the space in use and really enjoyed by the students. And as Tony said, I think we've been to the Flickr pages and the Facebook pages, and it's just wonderful to see that. Just a few weeks ago, a recent alum sent a link to a Facebook page to me entitled Thetas Love Mansueto. I went to the link, and the page was full of pictures of smiling students in the library's reading room. Now, I was only vaguely aware that there was a sorority on campus, but I'm very glad that our Thetas love our new library so much. Now, Rika and I are just truly forever grateful to the university and to what it gave us during our time here. You know, I can remember walking into this very room 37 years ago when I was a first-year student, my first week on campus, copy of Plato's Republic under my arm, and just so inspired as I sat here and studied. I knew I wasn't in Indiana anymore. And I often studied here. I am a heavy user, I think, as many of us of libraries. And it was really a wonderful place to study and think, very conducive to that. And I really hope the new library has that same effect that this library had on me to students for many years to come. Now, the university really opened up new worlds to me. It brought me into contact with just so many incredible people, both students and faculty, and really taught me, I believe, to think independently. It really wasn't so matter what I learned here, but it was learning how to learn, how to really go deep into a subject, really question what you find, looking at source data, and drawing your own conclusions. Those are things that I think have served me very well in life and really enhances everyone's life. Now, learning is just such great fun, and I had a terrific time during my undergraduate years. I lived over at Woodward Court, which is now gone. I lived over at the Shoreland, which is now gone. I don't know what that says about the university, but it's moving ahead. But I had a great time here, made some incredible friends, and still to this day, my closest friends are friends that I made during my college and graduate years here. So it's really gratifying, both for me and for Rika, to give back to the university that has really meant so much to both of us. Everyone involved in the library project has done such an incredible job. The professionalism, the standards, they've really, I think, just blown us away at every step of the turn. So, you know, whether it's the Board of Trustees, Helmut Jahn, certainly Judith Nadler and her team, the expert construction teams who are here today, who did all this very complicated construction work. But I also think it took a lot of courage on the part of all of these people to build the Mansueto Library. It was not the safe choice. It was not a conventional choice. Something could easily have gone wrong. The technology could not have worked. The design might have not been accepted. There's many ways things could have been derailed. In hindsight, I think it was obvious it was a terrific choice, but I can assure you it was much less obvious at the beginning. So, you know, I commend all the people who had the vision and the courage to build a library of this caliber. It's really a groundbreaking event, and I think it's going to change libraries in the future. So the work of all of these people, I think, is really going to contribute very meaningfully for the academic experience of those who attend the University of Chicago for generations to come. And Rika and I are just very proud and honored to be associated with it. Thank you very much.
It's an extraordinary pleasure to introduce the composer of the double helix, University Professor Augusta Read Thomas. Augusty. It's hard to know what to add to the great comments already. Mansueto Library has already become emblematic of the University of Chicago. What could be more Chicago than to have undergraduates lined up at 8 a.m. in the morning trying to get in to use the reading room? In fact, my younger son just started here as a first year, so of course I had to ask him, have you been there? And he said, oh yeah, of course, Dad, but it was too beautiful. I couldn't get any work done. So it is beauty, but of course what we celebrate today is form as well as function. And buried down beneath the beautiful elliptical reading room, of course, is 5 stories with 3.5 million volumes of scholarly works. And hidden, but just a little for the time being, are the extraordinary breakthroughs, the path-breaking scholarship that will emerge because of the availability of those volumes. So let me invite you to join us at a reception at the back to celebrate form and function, to celebrate Alexandrian fearlessness, and maybe even a little buccaneering. Thank you.